HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents American Visions, the United States, 1800 to 1860, by Edward L. Ayers. Read by Brandon Pollock. Preface. This book is about visions, imagined paths between things as they are and what they might become. To a remarkable extent, the visions that have defined the United States appeared in the first two-thirds of the 19th century. Fundamental elements of national life crystallized then, from the country's borders to the shape of its politics, from its religious identity to the themes of its literature. Americans of all kinds fashioned, word by word, a vocabulary to describe the new nation taking shape before their eyes. People across North America and beyond felt the rising power of the new United States at the beginning of the 19th century. Indigenous peoples from the Atlantic to the Pacific confronted the armies, settlers, missionaries, and agents of the expansive nation. The imperial powers of Britain, France, and Spain reckoned with the new country's ambitions. Mexico and Canada struggled over the future of North America. Democratic hope and possibility grew for white American citizens, even as slavery and dispossession gripped millions of others. The Americans who claimed to speak for the nation declared the continent theirs through the will of God or the inevitable working of economic progress. Others denied such boasts, instead championing ideals of universal human equality and dignity. A broad cast of characters, their lives woven together in the time they shared, shaped the volatile new nation. Frederick Douglass, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Harriet Beecher Stowe became famous then and remained so. Writers who struggled in their own times, Edgar Allan Poe, Herman Melville, and Henry David Thoreau, won veneration after their deaths. Nat Turner and John Brown ruptured history. Charles Grandison Finney and Joseph Smith transformed faith. P.T. Barnum pioneered American showmanship. Stephen Foster sought a distinctly American music. Samuel F.B. Morse and Samuel Colt became synonymous with their innovations, and John James Audubon and Louis Agassiz celebrated nature while denigrating most of humankind. Indigenous leaders William Apess and Black Hawk, female activists Angelina Grimke and Margaret Fuller, black speakers Maria Stewart and Frances E. Watkins, and abolitionists Sojourner Truth and William Wells Brown spoke words powerful then and now. Each person in this diverse cast articulated a vision, some in the language of religion, art, and literature, others in politics and power, and others in commerce and invention. People at the margins moved the center, the disenfranchised moved power, and the eccentric moved the expected. Individuals dismissed for their skin, sex, or peculiarity spoke for an America of freedom and connection, of possibility and responsibility. They did so from the traditions of the Declaration of Independence and the New Testament, from the individuality of art and literature, from traditions of African and indigenous cultures, and from a recognition of the mutual dependence of the human and the natural world. They articulated such powerful visions by confronting the moral failings of the nation. They faced opposition and obstruction, and they confronted their own limitations of understanding and compassion, but they glimpsed aspects of what America might be. The young United States veered in unexpected directions in this era. It seemed impossible in 1800 that American slavery would spread over an area the size of continental Europe and lead the United States into a war against another republic. Few white people imagined that native peoples would sustain their cultures and contest the power of the new nation for generations to come. Only the Mormon devout believed that their church would grow into a global faith. Few would have expected that, centuries later, "okay" would become the world's most frequently used phrase, that millions of Americans would remember the tune to "Oh, Susanna," or that young schoolchildren would learn about Johnny Appleseed. Americans have often turned to familiar stories to tame the confusion of this era, the complexities of remembering and forgetting. These decades are commonly described as the Age of Jackson and the Rise of the Common Man, the era of expansion and manifest destiny, the Second Great Awakening, and the antebellum era. Such terms domesticate the lurching history of the new United States, leaving out too much of the dissent and struggle that shaped America's history. We might better call this the era of the new nation, the story of government, economy, culture, and identity invented on the spot, of progress and wrong weaving together in ways that defined America's understanding of itself. The central concerns of this era still matter in the United States. Debates over the pursuit of black freedom, the place of women in private and public life, the rights of indigenous peoples, and the inclusion of new immigrants have not ceased. The early appearance of those struggles revealed, during the deepest darkness in American history, that a concern for rights of some can grow into respect for the rights and dignity of all. The language of empathy, inclusion, and mutual understanding forged in the first decades of American history, like the language of exclusion and possession forged at the same time, created a vocabulary of national self-reflection that is resonant still. My own time studying American history has led me to revisit the visions of the nation's defining era. I am an optimistic person who has written and taught about the worst wrongs in American history, slavery, war, violence, and justice, for 40 years. I have done so believing that by addressing those evils, we can perceive and counter their insidious legacies. Grappling with past injustices seemed a way to secure our progress. But it is sometimes hard to sustain that optimism when ugly scenes from the new United States reappear. Nativists and racists march, apocalyptic prophecies and conspiracies proliferate, and religious faith is wielded as a political weapon. Those who would rule the United States with such purposes claim the sanction of history. They dress in the garb of the frontier and battlefront. They wave flags and guns in defiance of democratic change. They declare ownership of an America seized through the violence of white settlers. Self-proclaimed patriots deny the wrongs of the past and refuse reconciliation or recompense for its victims. They seek control over history, expunging evidence of injustice in the name of national pride. But we can choose to remember a fuller American history, one that is more truly patriotic, one that evokes the nation's highest ideals of equality and mutual respect in the face of the nation's failings. Bold men and women in the new United States spoke without permission and often in defiance of those who held power. They evoked humane understanding in speeches, novels, paintings, and songs. They deflated pretension and hypocrisy. They wrote with care of the beauty and fragility of the natural world. Their visions remain powerful and necessary generations later. Chapter 1. Revelations, 1800 to 1829. Prophets. The native peoples of North America had shown themselves shrewd and adaptable in their centuries of interaction with Europeans. They welcomed some of what traders, priests, and diplomats offered, even as they pursued goals that had nothing to do with European desires or understanding. To the west, north, and south of the new United States, 800,000 native people traded with the British, Spanish, and French for furs and hides. Powerful circuits of trade radiated from the Great Lakes, coordinated by European men and native women. Other circuits of trade and power, shifting and growing, ranged through the Spanish territories to the south and west. The emergence of the United States in the East held little immediate consequence for these complicated webs of trade and diplomacy. The expedition of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, begun in 1803 through the lands of the Louisiana Purchase and beyond, revealed that the native population of North America was complex beyond comprehension. Whatever fate awaited the United States would be tied to those native peoples and alliances they might strike among themselves and with European powers. East of the Mississippi, native peoples had long confronted the people they called Americans, Europeans who had declared themselves independent of other Europeans. Indigenous peoples, diverse in language, religion, history, and loyalty, had struggled for centuries over ways to deal with the white Americans pushing on them from the east, north, and south. The Americans brought welcome trade, but they also brought alcohol, violence, disease, disruption, and religions that challenged indigenous beliefs and hierarchy. In the South, some among the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Muskogee, and Choctaw had begun to adopt American ways to their ends. They grew cotton and spun cloth, raised cattle and hogs, learned English, and listened to Christian missionaries. Unlike the French and British, the Americans demonstrated a relentless hunger for native land. They would purchase it with cash and annuities, take it with threats and bloodshed. The American population grew beyond reckoning. Endless numbers of settlers rushed in after the speculators and agents who signed treaties. The settlers showed little respect for boundaries and precedent. They took what they could, often with violence. Their greed threatened trade and accommodation that had bound people for generations. At the beginning of the 19th century, nearly half of the land claimed by the United States, in fact, lay under the control of native peoples who had not ceded their territories. From the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, indigenous nations had no intention of surrendering their lands to American settlers. They would leverage their connections with European nations, far more powerful than the United States, to resist and channel the flood of settlers who pushed from the east. The Americans had only a small army and weak officials who seemed unable to control the ravenous settlers who arrived in ever greater numbers. A native prophet arose to warn his people that they could no longer accommodate the Americans. In the Indiana Territory in 1805, Tenskwatawa of the Shawnees emerged from a trance to tell all who would listen that native peoples were one, that they must set aside their tribal identities to find common purpose against the white people. The Great Spirit had given the land to them, not to the whites, who were a mere foulness that had washed up from the waters to the east. Tenskwatawa, whose name meant the open door, told pilgrims to his village that they must give up the ways of the Americans, the woven clothing and hats, the domestic animals and dogs, the alcohol and religion. Even firearms should not be used for hunting, only defense. The prophet and his followers built, in 1808, a new town, which the white people called Tippecanoe, or Prophet's Town, devoted to the Master of Life. 60 cottages surrounded a longhouse and hewn logs for benches where people could listen to Tenskwatawa, who, white visitors reported, spoke powerfully, with his eyes closed, in a solemn voice. Young men traveled great distances to hear the prophet. All native visitors found welcome in the house of the stranger, a space set aside for new arrivals to the town. Prophet's Town stood positioned between the Wabash and Tippecanoe rivers, ideal for defense and for trading. Surrounding villages and cornfields stretched for a mile distant, and word of the place spread for hundreds of miles in all directions. 6,000 people gathered in Prophet's Town, making it the largest settlement on the western frontier, larger than Pittsburgh or Cincinnati. The town boasted its own warriors, religious figures, and diplomats. Many white leaders in Washington and governors in the territories feared and despised Tenskwatawa. Many Indian leaders did as well, for they benefited from dealings with the Americans that the prophet challenged and threatened to upset. The prophet's older brother, Tecumseh, an impressive warrior, religious figure, and diplomat, grew in public stature. Tecumseh called on William Henry Harrison, the territorial governor, at his fort in 1810, traveling with an honor guard of 75 men. The local white newspaper translated the speech Tecumseh delivered during the visit. The Great Spirit, he instructed Harrison, had given the lands as common property to all the Indians, and they could not nor should not be sold without the consent of all. All the tribes of Indians on the continent formed but one nation, and they would have no more chiefs, but in future to have everything done under the direction of the warriors. Tecumseh ended his speech with a penetrating question to his white listeners. How can we have confidence in the white people? When Jesus Christ came upon the earth, you killed him and nailed him to a cross. You thought he was dead, but you were mistaken. The white people, Tecumseh warned all native people who would listen, are like poisonous serpents. When chilled, they are feeble and harmless, but invigorate them with warmth, and they sting their benefactors to death. The red men wished for peace, But where the white people are, there is no peace for them. The white people have destroyed many nations of red men because they were not united, because they were not friends to each other. The white men, he told those he hoped to recruit, are only men. They could be defeated. In 1811 and 1812, 3 major earthquakes, interspersed with many smaller shocks, radiated from a place called New Madrid on the Mississippi River. Strange disruptions in the land and air shook the country all the way to the Atlantic. Bells clanged and clocks tolled in distant cities. Steeples swayed and compass needles swung. The New Madrid earthquakes shattered native lives along the Mississippi. The tremors and floods destroyed farmland, dislocated villages, and swamped hunting fields. Solid land became quicksand. Networks of exchange broke among the Cherokees, Delawares, and Shawnees. Some native leaders saw in the earthquakes a sign that Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa were right. A chief of the Potawatomi told his people that the Great Spirit is angry because many children have sold their lands to white settlers and speculators. The Creeks, Choctaws, Cherokees, and Chickasaws in the southeast fought among themselves over the best ways to deal with enemies who schemed to take their land. A Cherokee man named Sequoyah stood in the middle of these conflicts. Born the son of a white man and a native mother in eastern Tennessee about 1770, Sequoyah became a skilled silversmith and trader. He joined with those who signed a treaty that traded eastern lands for allotments in the Arkansas Territory. Sequoyah experimented with a radical idea, producing a syllabary at the Cherokee language. Sequoyah, like most Cherokee, neither spoke nor read English, but he saw the advantages of written language. After years of trial and error, he devised a system in which 86 symbols represented syllables in Cherokee. He adopted English letters from a spelling book, turning some of them upside down. Sequoyah traveled to the Cherokee Territory in Arkansas and told leaders of his system. He confronted skeptics who doubted that one man could devise an entire written language, so he proved the system by teaching his young daughter, Ioka, the symbols. She sent her father a message, which he opened before the Cherokee Council to demonstrate its power. Sequoyah returned east carrying a speech from one of the Arkansas Cherokee leaders. Reading it aloud, he persuaded Eastern leaders as well of his gift. The new written language, easily learned, spread quickly. White missionaries were surprised and puzzled to see symbols carved into trees and fences, and then to learn that Cherokee people were sending letters to one another. Resistant to the idea of the Cherokee syllabary at first, since reading the symbols meant knowing Cherokee, which few white people did, the missionaries came to see its power. With Cherokee help, they translated the New Testament, Cherokee laws, and eventually a newspaper into the language. Sequoyah's syllabary gave the Cherokee a valuable tool and pride, but also helped spread among them the ideals of literacy and of Christianity that eroded traditional authority. Capital, Banner, and Anthem. Dolly Madison faced a problem. Her husband James had been elected President of the United States in 1808. That much was not unexpected, for James Madison had drafted much of the Constitution and served as Secretary of State and ally of Thomas Jefferson through his 8 tumultuous years as president. People respected Madison's character, even though they worried whether his slight frame and diffidence could bear the weight of the office. His wife, 17 years younger, offered a welcome counterpart to her husband. She used her charm, intelligence, and taste to make his presidency and the fragile country over which he presided a success. Mrs. Madison did not have much to work with in Washington City. Visionary plans for a city to be left the current city with looming gaps between buildings connected by muddy roads. The executive mansion was poorly suited to public events and in fact had rarely been used for such. Americans remained unsure of how to adorn such a place, for they had rejected British pretension and viewed French style with suspicion. Americans remained uncertain about many things, in fact, including how to make their elaborately balanced government work. The early years of the Republic had been filled with the rumor and reality of cabal and conspiracy, of dueling and scandal. Dolly Madison worked to change the tenor of Washington, beginning with the interior of the executive mansion. Carefully selecting American-made furniture and furnishings, she sought to create a space that embodied the spirit of the new republic, confident and modern, yet welcoming and republican. The statues and paintings of the house celebrated American scenes and heroes, featuring a copy of a portrait of Washington by the American artist Gilbert Stuart. Mrs. Madison bedecked the parlor in sunflower yellow, framed with yellow draperies around the windows, yellow sofas and chairs, and a rising sun in yellow damask on the fireboard before the fireplace. Mirrors reflected the splendor of the room and those fortunate enough to visit it. She made the larger oval room even more impressive, featuring red velvet curtains. She presented herself in simple but elegant dress. Observers agreed that Dolly Madison had found a style worthy of a great, if still emerging nation. Mrs. Madison helped Mr. Madison knit together a government of far-flung places and character. Men and women who had never seen a piano or tasted champagne had to be made comfortable alongside those who had dined in the grand houses of London and Paris. Men who schemed at the head of factions had to chat with one another in the polite company of women. New Englanders and Southerners, Easterners and Westerners had to mingle with those whose manners did not always please them. Diplomats who arrived in fine golden carriages jostled among people who had not traveled beyond the borders of their home states before their Washington sojourn. Political work was accomplished in this congenial setting, the work of finding common purpose and direction for a divergent nation. During the season when the federal government was in session, Dolly Madison hosted events almost every evening in the executive mansion. People came by the hundreds, so many, in fact, that the gatherings became known as squeezes, as guests happily jammed into parlors and hallways. The executive mansion became popularly known as the White House in 1810, a name more domestic and welcoming than the previous President's Palace. The building, like all of those in Washington City, had been constructed by enslaved labor. The cooks who prepared the food and carried the trays among the guests were black and held in slavery. The Madisons claimed some of those servants as their property and hired others from neighboring slave owners. White guests generally did not comment on the black people on whose skill and care they depended. Dolly's favorite cousin, Edward Coles, a young man from Virginia who anguished over his inheritance of enslaved people as he served as personal secretary to Dolly's husband, sarcastically congratulated Madison for presiding over a great republic where the revolting sight of slavery filled the capital's streets. Dolly Madison, raised as a Quaker in Philadelphia, but now accustomed to service by enslaved people, smoothed over the contradictions in the nation's raw capital as best she could. Not far away, in a city James and Dolly Madison knew well, the Virginia General Assembly gathered in Richmond in the fall of 1811, bringing in leading men and their families from across the state and beyond. The capital of Virginia boasted Thomas Jefferson's austerely beautiful state capitol building, modeled on a Roman temple, the nation's first neoclassical public building. Richmond also possessed flour mills that drew power from the canal that bypassed the rocky turbulence of the falls on the James. Almost half of Richmond's population of 5,000 was African American, most of them enslaved, with hundreds of free black people living among them. Memories of Gabriel Prosser's rebellion and its bloody repression in 1800 lingered a decade later. Rumors of complicit Frenchmen and Quakers, of revenge against enslavers and white women, of biblical injunction and sanction had never been put to rest. The winter social season of that year, remarked one young woman, proved the gayest winter Richmond had ever known, and often we went from one entertainment to another and even a third on the same evening. There was dancing for the young people and cards for the old. On December 26th, over 640 people bought tickets to Richmond's theater. Groups of girls filled boxes, their Grecian dresses accentuating their figures, young men hovering about. African American people, both enslaved and free, stood on the floor. Wealthy white men sported canes and cravats, their wives bearing elegant jewelry and the latest hairstyles from England and France. The program promised over 4 hours of entertainment. 2 full-length plays interspersed with comic songs, children's performances, dances, and a solo by the leading female of the cast. Early in the show, a candelabra, its ropes caught in pulleys, tipped toward a backdrop. Flames leapt to the paint-covered hemp sheet, and then to the pine ceiling, the raw wood spotted with beads of rosin. Within minutes, the roof hissed with flames that spread to other backdrops. The crowd, trapped by narrow hallways and doors, panicked and were trampled by those behind them. Many tried to help others escape. A muscular doctor lowered a dozen women and girls to an enslaved blacksmith, Gilbert Hunt, who rushed to the theater to offer aid. In 10 minutes, the building's roof and stairs collapsed, killing those above and below. The Richmond Theater fire marked the worst public disaster of the new nation. Members of the United States Congress wore black for the next month. All balls and parties were canceled in Washington. Disturbing rumors circulated that the fire had been set by enslaved people as a signal for insurrection. Ministers in cities and towns far from Richmond judged the conflagration a divine sign against the prevailing but most unchristian and most baneful amusement of the theater, a token of divine displeasure. One sermon declared that all those who encourage this sinful practice of plays, etc., are not worthy in this respect to be called Christians. Baptists and Methodists, already opposed to theater going and devoted to spreading the word of salvation, grew even stronger. A camp meeting near Richmond attracted 4,000 people, their singing echoing a half-mile away. Evangelical leaders later remembered that Richmond changed profoundly and immediately after the fire. Never perhaps has the sudden destruction of men, women, and children, and one overwhelming ruin, produced a greater moral effect, recalled one minister. All classes of community bowed down before the Lord. New charitable organizations served the poor. Aristocratic fashions gave way to more restrained hues. Card-playing virtually stopped. Local newspapers began to carry religious news. The religious revolution, however, was more complete in memory than in actuality. The conversion of the nation to evangelical religion had far to go. The veiled deism and skepticism of Thomas Jefferson and other national leaders still held adherents. A future bishop in the Episcopal Church in Virginia admitted that he expected any educated man he met in those days to be a skeptic, if not an avowed unbeliever. Across the country, in raucous cities and on the ragged frontier, the number of unchurched far outnumbered those who claimed formal membership. As Richmond struggled to recover, the new nation gambled for high stakes as it challenged the world's most powerful empire. The British undermined Americans' determination to dominate the continent and seized American sailors on the seas. In what enemies called, jeeringly, Mr. Madison's War, in 1812, the United States declared that it would no longer tolerate Britain's intrusive power on the seas and on America's borders. New England Federalists, seeing in the war a Republican grab for power and an unjustified animus against the British, voted against the war and withheld support, threatening to secede. A war launched to protect the new nation might destroy it in its infancy. The war against Britain went badly until, on one front after another, it began to go well for the United States. On the Great Lakes, outnumbered British and native fighters were overrun by Americans fortified by militia on horseback from Kentucky. Tenskwatawa, the prophet, watched the Battle of the Thames from behind British lines and retreated with them, an exile from the lands he believed a gift from the Great Spirit. His brother Tecumseh was killed in the battle. Kentucky militiamen flayed the corpse of the man they believed to be Tecumseh, using strips of his skin to sharpen their razors. On the Chesapeake Bay, the Royal Navy longed to punish the hypocritical Virginians who preached liberty while growing rich from bondage. About 3,400 black Virginians managed to escape to freedom aboard British ships from plantations and towns along the rivers and bays. Most were young men, though women and children increasingly found British allies as well. The runaways directed the British to the most strategic targets, as well as to places where enslaved relatives or friends might seize freedom. The British, ranging at will through the Chesapeake, aimed their contempt toward Washington City. Retaliating for the burning of the Canadian capital of York by the Americans in the preceding year, The British commanders relished the humiliation of the American capital. Dolly Madison.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?